Hello, welcome back to the Fennel Shed. It's November now and we're ready to look at the third part of our block of the month. And this is a really important block because it's the one that is smack dab right in the middle of the quilt. It really tells the story of what the quilt is about. Your eye is drawn right into the very center of it. So this is the block on my original. And you can see the outer frame is a star. The next frame is a star on a strong contrast background. So you can really see the outline of this square. Then we have a yet smaller star, and then finally we've got a tiny little 2-inch square star, which means that the star points are half an inch. That tiny star is an optional one. If you feel that that is just a bridge too far, you can put in a 4.5 or a 2.5 inch square and to fill that spot. You can go as far as you choose to go. But those of you that are getting the packs every month, all of these pieces will come prepared, cut out, placed, ready for you to sew. So what you will find in your pack will be all the elements. The biggest pieces will make the outer frame. The next set of pieces here will make this inner 8-point star with a lovely blue background that'll pop. The next set of pieces down are here. I've marked them with yellow because I'm marking on a dark background, and that makes this 4-inch star. And then finally these very small pieces will make the little 2-inch star. And then at the very, very tail end, we have a piece here that has a gold dot in the middle. It's been fussy cut. This is the epicenter of everything in the quilt. We've got this tiny little circular pattern. So if you've got something, those of you that are making from your own fabrics, if you've got something that you can fussy cut, that can be a lovely feature right in the middle of the quilt, that's the one to go for. So I'm going to start showing you how to create all these half square triangles. We make a set of half square triangles for the outer frame first. And then after that, it's all variations on flying geese. The main size, the smaller size, and then finally the tiny size. So to get these lovely star points, very often you see these star points, and if you look closely, they're made in pairs, which leaves a seam in the middle like this one. I'm going to eliminate that seam because it's a much cleaner look if it's made in sets of flying geese. So I'm going to show you how to make sets of flying geese like this, which is just a big wide triangle but without the center seam, because the center seam can be very ugly, and because this is a focal point of the quilt right in the middle of the quilt, we want everything about it to be crisp and clean. So I'm going to show you how all these different elements are made. The first part of making this block is all involved in making a set of 16 matching star points that rotate all the way around the outer frame of the block. The first 8 of these are regular half square triangles. The next 8 comprise of 4 sets of a set of 4 flying geese units. So we begin with these half square triangles and we make these as a set of 8. It really does help in that you're sewing on a larger piece of fabric, and it's very, very important to get this accurate. The measurements will all be given in the instructions, but these midlines that come through will be the outer edges of your half square triangle units. So you can't fudge it. You can't be, that's, it's round about right. If you steal a 16th from here, it's going to be added on there and both are going to be wrong. So you've got to get it accurate. These are 2 5 3/4 inch squares paired together. If you find you get better results making these individually, by all means quarter this before you sew and sew your diagonal seams onto individual sets of squares, if you find you get a better result that way. I have done it to create the set of 8, but bearing in mind that I have to get this done accurately, I cannot do it in a hurry. So I have marked the midline vertically, horizontally, and both diagonals. Then I've stitched a 1/4 inch, and it's a scant but consistent 1/4 inch. It's not a roundabout 1/4 inch, and it's not a fat 1/4 inch. It's just slightly shy of a full 1/4 inch because you want it to be a little bit generous in terms of your wriggle room. So I've stitched 2 lines, one on either side of both diagonals only. The most frequent mistake that people make is to sew each side of the diagonal and then sew each side of the cross as well. The cross is only your cutting lines. The only lines that you sew are diagonals. And once you have those stitched, and if you zoom in, you can see that I've marked the stitching lines as well to give you an indication of where those go. And then when you take it to your cutting board, as I have here, you cut in sequence. The midpoint is marked, and it should be where both diagonals and both vertical and horizontal lines intersect absolutely spot on at one point in the middle. If that isn't working, you've gone somewhere wrong, go back and check it. If necessary, recut your fabric. But now I want to cut through the vertical, then the horizontal, and you see I'm moving the board but not moving the cloth. And my ruler checks that I am on a midline and cut again. And only when those are done do I go back and cut the diagonals. Because in this instance, the vertical and the horizontal are the ones that you've got to get right. Otherwise your half square triangles will not be the right size. Now I have got 8 individual half square triangles, and each one of those, when I open it, should give me a 2.5 inch square. If they aren't exact, by all means go back after you've pressed them, go back and trim them, that each one of these should be 2.5 inches square exactly. Every piece of this quilt, as I make all the component parts, I will check, and where need be I'll trim. Trimming makes such a difference to the accuracy and crispness of the finished result. So we've made these set of 8 half square triangles, and if you've used scant seams, all of these should be slightly bigger than 2.5 inches square, and that's so that you have room to trim them square and end up with a lovely clean result. So all of our rulers will have a 45-degree line. You place the 45-degree line on the angle that's running across the diagonal across the block, and trim away anything that is outside your 2.5 inch line. And then you turn it, and with that you turn your ruler and you find your 45-degree angle on the other side, and repeat. And again, anything that is outside 2.5 inches now, because this opposite side has been trimmed, we can take that to be true. We can keep our diagonal right, and anything that's outside that 2.5 inch line gets trimmed away. And the fourth side, 2.5 inch line here is on the edge, the diagonal is on the diagonal, the top edge is on the top edge, it's 2.5 inches down here, and this last bit, I know these are millimeter sized pieces, sometimes only a hair's width, but the difference between a piece like this that is roundabout right and a piece like this that is accurate, and particularly where you've lost these little tails at the corners, you find you'll get a beautiful result. I've just placed those. I'll place those into the block later on to show you what I mean. So trim as you go. So now you can see that we've put together the 4 corners for this central block, and the next sections that we need to do are flying geese, and this is how we make our flying geese. We begin with a square of what the background is going to be, 5¼ square, and don't worry about the numbers because they are all in your pattern. We put the 2 contrast squares that will be the star points on the diagonal corners. I've already marked the diagonal on this and stitched, as we did before, 1/4 inch on either side, both sides that is, of the marked line. Then when you've got that stitched, press it, because this line can become quite bubbly because you've got 2 lines of stitching that sometimes can be pulling them in opposite directions. So give it a good press, makes the cutting much easier to get right, and cut right through. So we end up with these, and these fold back and get pressed on both sides. And our extra squares go in face down on the opposite corners. These get marked. It's much easier to mark them on a flat surface before you introduce them to the other part of the unit. So that's how those get marked. Once they're marked and in, by all means take time to put in a couple of pins so that they don't shift as you sew, and put your pins in such a way that they're not going to cause any obstruction as you sew through this. So I have 2 sets of flying geese to make to this size. and that'll make a huge difference to the block. Now, the flying geese are well underway. I've stitched the first sections in place, then you saw me put the remaining squares onto the opposite free corners. Stitch again either side. That stitching, what's a good tip to know is that you should be starting, there's like a W shape here. You should be starting your seams in the valley of those W points, and that should be where your 1/4 inch seam roughly begins, and from that to the outer corner. Press again, and then carefully cut through and open and press, and that's how you create flying geese. Now, none of these is perfect at this stage. Can't be. You've got all these little tails, you've got raw edges, so it really is, if you can look at what I've done here and compare before being trimmed to after being trimmed, there is no comparison. Trying to sew this into a completed work, there's so many things going to get in your way as you try to do your seams, so it really is worth taking the time to trim. So these two sets come down to be 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches. This one comes down to being 1.5 by 2 inches, and this tiny tinsy one comes down to being 1 inch by 1.5 inches. And then the very center of our quilt is this guy. So I'm going to go back now and trim the rest of these, and join me when I begin to build the block. Once you have all your flying geese components made, that's when you take time out to trim them all. These have all been trimmed. I'm going to show you in detail how to trim. This big one needs to be 2.5 inches this way by 4.5 inches that way. So basically we take anything away that is wider than the 2.5 inch mark. We don't want to lose anything on this side because we need to keep our seam allowance. So I just tidy that side, taking off those rough threads and tails, turn it round and measure my 2.5 inches and take away anything that is outside the 2.5 inches, but leaving enough here for your seam allowance. Never trim less than 1/4 inch away from that point, because that's your seam allowance. Then in the other direction, this one is 4.5. Conveniently, this ruler is 4.5 inches. But what you have to remember is, if this is going to be 4.5 inches wide, you want it to be 2.25 from the midpoint in both directions. So you don't just look at the overall size, you look at where your midline is, and you take everything away 2.25 out that way and turn it again, and there's only a thread to come off there. But again, you see the difference between an untrimmed unit and a trimmed unit. We'll do this one just to remind you. Anything outside 2.5, and they very often bow during the construction, so that straightens that. 2.5 here, just takes away the tails. That's what we want. We want to leave this little 1/4 inch overlap for our seam allowance. Turn it again. We want this to be 4.5, but with the midline coming down into the middle of that V valley. Trim straight. And trim straight again, and you can use the cross lines on your ruler to reassure you that this is a rectangle with 4 90-degree corners. So that's that set. Coming down, gradually getting smaller all the time. This one is 1.5 inches. 1.5 inches in depth. Carefully, carefully, again, paying attention to my seam allowance here and only trimming what I can afford to trim. And it's 2.5 inches this way. So again, we divide that in half, 1.25 out from the midline, and trim, turn it, 1.25 from the midline. And that one's done. Down now to our tiny little, and he is 1 inch side to side. And this inner section, I am literally just taking threads away. And he's 1.5 inches edge to edge, which is 3/4 inch on either side of that midpoint. And the smaller they are, the more precise and careful you need to be. So this is the star that's going to be right at the middle of my quilt, and these are the corners. So I'm going to build these back into here. Can you follow me to the block? Starting from the outside. And those are the star points for my outer star. Then we want this lovely clean contrast, that the next star is framed against this blue background. Then the next star in is much darker. And that has those corners. And then finally, right in the middle, will sit the tiniest star of all. And as I say, if you feel this is just too tiny to manage, you can cut a slightly bigger section of this lovely center fabric, and in your kit there'll be a big enough piece to allow you to do that. But I just love that star that goes right into infinity point, and the corners for that star. And that's all the sections prepared. Here you can see the process now of assembling all those separate sections that we've made so carefully. So at this stage I like to work from the outer frame back in, joining the flying geese. So you have 4 flying geese. You put a star point on each side of all 4, and then onto 2 of those units you put a corner. So you can see there's 2 strips that are long and 2 strips that are short. Once you have those, the outer frame in place, you take away the sections that do the blue contrast star. They're gradually getting smaller as you work towards the middle. For this one, we just have 2 flying geese with corners attached and the original 2 flying geese set back in place. And I talk there about how to make sure, where possible, that seams where they meet, if you've got 2 seams on the inner section that are folded inwards, then the corresponding seams that meet them on the next section, where possible, fold them outwards. It's not always possible to do it, but where you can, they sit much better. They nest at the junctions. Now we're in on the 3rd frame and the final center star. Now what I haven't shown in this video is that where you don't want to make that tiny star in the center, in your pattern I've put in a little diamond in a square that is perfectly acceptable in the middle. It still has that lovely gold spot centerpiece, but here we're making the tiny star, and all I can tell you about the tiny star is that the smaller it is, the more exact that you have to be. And I did quite a lot of unpicking and trimming and pressing and starching to get that small star to stay in place. Once you have the center star made, you add on flying geese top and base, and the geese with corners side to side. That point it's 4.5 inches square, another set of flying geese top and base, and the sides that have the corners on. That one really stands out because of the blue background, and you keep tidying up and pressing really well on the reverse as you go. And finally the outer frame. And here I make a point about, and it applies to all of these, when you're sewing a piece that has that flying geese triangle, you don't want to overlap your sewing line. Cannot go beyond that junction at the base of that V. If you think of the V as where the geese's wings meet, you don't want your seam to come in any further. So at times I would take my friction pen and put a tiny little mark there just so I can see it clearly. And now you can see the final block, which I thought was finished, but the eagle-eyed amongst you will see that one side of it is on back to front. And that is just so typical of something that we do just at the last hurdle, when we think we're just a few feet from winning the race, and you think, whoopee, the block's finished. Luckily, I did notice, I'm here putting the rest of the blocks in place around, but I did notice before I got to the stage of sewing it on to sashes that one whole side piece there had to be removed and restitched in place facing the other way around. But in the completed set of 9, you'll see that I did catch on to it. Anything like that, once we finish it, particularly if we finish it when we're tired or if we finish up late at night, take a photograph of it, stand back and look at it from a distance, ask somebody else to have a look at it. There's nothing as infuriating as not catching it until it's in the middle of a big quilt. Even worse, if you don't spot it until after the quilt has been quilted, and it's happened to me on a few occasions. So when you think you have a piece complete, try to stand back and look again. So those are the 9 centre blocks ready for sashes and posts. And now you can see how the centre of your quilt will look. We've placed the block we've just made, the star centre block, in place with the other 8 originally existing blocks around it. Now in your pack going out to you now at the end of November, early December, by the time it reaches you, you will have the materials for the star. I'd include both options that you'll see in the illustrations for this centerpiece, whether you want the darker or lighter version you can choose. There will also be sufficient fabric for you to make the easier version if you prefer not to make the tiny 2-inch star that's at the centerpiece. Also in your pack will be all the sashes and posts with the posts already attached, so that if you have your blocks made, you can then proceed and put this full set of 9 together. Now that set of 9 comprises a quarter of the full surface area of the quilt, so that's a significant part of the quilt made, and you can really now judge how your colours are working. And so I hope you enjoy putting the star together. It's just 1 block this month, so that it gives you all time then to put the sashes and posts in, and also time to get all your pre-Christmas work done. I hope you enjoy it.